Hello. I didn't introduce myself because I was going to do it here. My name is Mandy Michael. I'm the front-end development manager at 7 West Media. That's like Channel 7, the West Australian and Perth Now. You can find me on Twitter, Mandy_Kerr, and I'm on CodePen as Mandy Michael. All of the examples that I'm going to show you today are available on CodePen. So at the end, I'll tweet out a link to the collection that contains them all. So if you want to go and have a look at them or have a bit of experimentation, you can. And what I'm going to talk about today is creating text effects with CSS. Now, this is kind of, I hope, less about creating specific effects and specific visual representations, and more about how you can use new and existing CSS properties to do really interesting and creative things with searchable, editable, and selectable text on the web. All of my demos are searchable, selectable, and editable, and the reason for that is you can make lots of things with SVG and Canvas and images on the web, but making text, real text, look cool is a lot more challenging. So as we go through and I show you some cool CSS things, focus less on the final result and more on how you can apply those techniques to do your own thing and create your own fun stuff. Before I get into showing you any examples, there are a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The first one is data attributes. I don't use these in all of my text effects, but they're really handy to keep in mind if you're doing fairly complex and more difficult effects, because these combined with pseudo elements are going to give you extra layers to work with. So data attributes are basically, for those that aren't aware, custom attributes that allow you to exchange information between HTML and the DOM. And in our case, what it's going to do is let us share the text that's in our HTML element with the CSS, which is pretty neat. The other reason that I like to use data attributes is so that I don't have to duplicate the text in my markups. So I don't want to have the H1 3 times for 3 layers, because that's not very accessible and it's harder to maintain, and my HTML will just be really messy and I don't like that. So this is why we use data attributes. And to use a data attribute is really, really simple. You just add it onto your HTML element, in this case a H1. You always prefix it with data dash, and then you can call it whatever you want. I've called it heading because it's a H1, but you could call it data Batman if you wanted. It doesn't really matter as long as you remember what the name is. So on its own, the data attribute is not particularly useful, which is why we're going to combine it with our pseudo element. And that is where we're going to get our layers from. So this is what pseudo elements look like in the DOM. It's basically a before and an after. You get these for most HTML elements. Inputs, they don't work on, but for text effects, it works really great for headings, paragraphs, all that kind of stuff. So with the H1, the pseudo, and the 2 pseudo elements, this is going to give us 3 layers to work with. And in order to get the pseudo elements to use the content that's in our heading tag, we're going to jump over into our CSS, which will look a little bit like this. So we've got H1, 2 colons, and then whatever pseudo element you're using, before or after. And then you always have to add a content property for a pseudo element. So sometimes you might put an empty string or like text in there, or maybe an icon. In this case, what we're going to do is use this syntax here, and inside the brackets, we're going to put whatever we called our data attribute. So in my case, data heading. And what that's going to do is make my H1's before pseudo element use the text from my data attribute. So with this in mind, I'm going to show you how to make this. It's really simple, so it's a great way to demonstrate how these work. So let me just bring up CodePen. Can you guys see that code there, or should I make it bigger? Let's make it bigger. Yeah? Okay, cool. So if you look at the HTML, you can see I've got my H1, and then I've got my text in the H1, and the text that I've got in there is the same in my data attribute. Don't worry about this. That is literally just there so that I can do this. so I can show you that it's editable text. So it's not really important for the effect. If we jump over into the SAS, I need to do this on my side too. We can see that I've got a little bit set up here, but I'm going to go through it step by step. So the first part is the linear gradient, which is sat on the HTML and the body of the page. You can just do it on one, but I'm lazy. And essentially all I'm doing is setting a linear gradient to set half white and half black on the page, and that's going to be at a 50% mark. And where you have your gradient split is really important for the rest of the effect. So the next thing that I'm going to do is change the color of my H1 to white. And that's going to load, and that's going to make the second half of my text white. Then, as you can see, I've got white space, no wrap. The reason that that is in there is because this text effect only works on single line, unfortunately. I will show you a way to do it on multi-line later, but for the time being, this one only works on one line. And then what we're going to do is set up the pseudo element. So basically, as I've shown you before, we put our content property in with our data attribute. It needs to be set to position absolute, and the reason for that is if you don't set it to position absolute, they'll just stack side by side, which is not very useful. So this will make it sit on top of my H1, and I just put the left in to make sure that it aligns perfectly. Then the next step is making the color of my pseudo element black. And I don't know if you can see this, but you can kind of see a white outline. Can you see that? That's because my pseudo element is sitting over the top of my H1. So all I need to do now is set a width of 50% on my pseudo element, and then set it to overflow hidden. Oops. And then that gives us the effect, which, as I said before, is editable, selectable, and searchable. So it's really easy to create these kinds of effects for single line, which seems like it might not be very useful, but you can make a lot of really cool layouts with that. So if we go to, this is not mirroring at all. Just a quick rundown of how that works, because I find diagrams really helpful. Basically, I've got my H1, which is white. I put the pseudo element on top and set the color to black. I add a width of 50%, which is where my gradient splits, and then I set it to overflow hidden, and that gives me a split vertical layout. And once you have this kind of width concept in mind, you can make stuff like this. This is editable as well. The only difference here is that I'm using height instead of width, and I'm offsetting it with a transform. It looks a little bit like this. So the H1 is on the bottom, and then I'm using a pseudo element on top with a height of 50%, and I set the color of that pseudo element to white, and that masks the top layer of the H1. And then I put another pseudo element on top, which is in black, and then I offset it to the left. And that gives me the fractured text look. You can make all sorts of things like this, like this, like this. All this is editable and selectable and searchable text using a single H1 with a data attribute and pseudo elements. You can do this. I tried to remake this poster, but I couldn't get the right font. So if you followed me on Twitter, you would have seen me getting really upset. But this is, again, is just one H1 that I've offset. If anyone can find that font, please send it to me. Or you can do something like this where you just reflect and rotate. Again, one H1. So that's what's great about that effect is because we're not doing anything fancy, we're not using any new CSS properties or values, it works pretty much everywhere that matters. It definitely works in IE9. Unsure if it works in IE8, but if anybody would like to check and let me know, that would be great. I haven't opened IE8 for a really long time and I don't plan to. Well, those days are behind me. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was blend modes. because you can accomplish that split vertical layout with blend modes a lot easier. So again, if you have a look over here at my HTML, I don't have any data attributes because I don't need them to make this with blend modes. If we jump over into the CSS, I still have my linear gradient like I did before. And in the H1, I've got my color set to white, which is why it's white over here. And then all I need to do is add mix, blend mode, and then we go difference. Different, there we go. And the great thing about this is that this one's multi-line. Now, you might be wondering why I bothered showing you the other one. It's not just because of browser support. The reason that this is a problem is that if you decide that you want specific colors, blend modes aren't particularly useful because you're mixing two colors. So the way that difference works, basically, if you're blending with white, it inverts the color value, and if you're blending with black, it has no change. It kind of takes the blend mode and the base color and picks the lighter of the two. So you can try other blend modes. All the ones that exist in Photoshop are available in CSS, like multiply or screen or exclusion. But because they're blending colors, you don't have as much control over what they look like. So browser support, great in Chrome and Firefox, terrible in Edge and IE. Partial support in Safari, which refers to a subset of blend modes. Difference is one of the ones that's supported in Safari. No support in default browser for Android, but Chrome on Android does have support for blend modes. So you kind of got to take into consideration support here. If you're only supporting like bleeding edge stuff, you're probably going to be okay. But what you can do with blend modes is stuff like this. This uses two pseudo elements and a H1 and just transforms them and then applies a blend mode. You can do something like this. This is basically a mask over a, wrong one, over a canvas, which I really like. You can make something like this. Or you can do something like this. What I like about this one is because I'm blending it, the text shadow also blends as well, so you can kind of see the image in the text shadow that I've applied. But this kind of clipping the background effect, you can actually do with something else in CSS, and that's background clip. I don't know, can you see the gradient changing? Yeah, you can. Yeah, so this is really easy to do in CSS as well. I'm going to bring up my trusty split vertical layout again. As you can see, let's look at HTML. No data attribute, don't need it. The background clip's awesome. We set up our background gradient exactly the same as before. But what we're going to do is also put that background gradient on our H1, except we're going to invert the colors. So this one half on the left is going to be black, and on the right it's going to be white. And the reason for that will be obvious, because when you add the background clip property, which is just WebKit background clip, and you say text, it'll basically clip the background, whatever it is, whether it's an image or a gradient or whatever, to the text region. And now what that's doing is you can't see the gradient because it's only where the text exists. Now, in order to get this to display the gradient in the text, you have to add another property, which is WebKit text fill color, and we set that to transparent. And that clips the gradient to just the text region. And like blend modes, this is multi-line as well. And this is a really simple way to achieve the clipped gradient effect. I really like this one. I think this is my favorite way to do it because you have more control. So you can pick, because we're not blending, you can pick any color that you want. These are my two favorites, if you're wondering. Rebecca Purple and Sky Blue, they're my go-tos. Yeah, so much better than blend modes because you have more control, better than pseudo elements and data attributes with widths because you can do multi-line. You don't need data attributes, it's a lot simpler. Unfortunately, support is weird. Background clip is great in everything, assuming you use the unofficial WebKit prefix. Text fill color, no support in IE. Edge does have support though. And no support on default Android browser, which is kind of sucky, but because you need both for it to work, it's kind of one of those annoying things. Why did you do one without the other? I don't understand. So things you can make, this, I like this, it's soothing. I have it up on my computer sometimes just to watch. You can make gold text. This one is actually a Photoshop tutorial that I remade in CSS like last week or something. I'm so happy because I've been wanting to make it for ages. It's just a background gradient with text shadows for highlights. You can make this. I made this last night because I didn't have enough examples. I was really quite proud of it. Yeah, you can put your name in that if you've got kids that like Frozen. It's editable. So, yeah, you want to. You're all going to go and look at my CodePen and do it. I know you are. So you can blend, you can clip, you can cut things in half. But probably my favorite text effect is actually just using layered fonts. And what's great about layered fonts is because they're just fonts, they work everywhere that supports font face, which is pretty much all we need to support these days, I hope. If you have to support other things, I am very sorry. When working with layered fonts on the web, the one thing that I would say that's really important is that you use a font that's made to be layered. Because if you try and do this with a Open Sans, you are going to have a really hard time. I tried to do this and it was not fun because normal fonts aren't made to be layered, whereas specially made layered fonts are. And there are a lot of them on the web that you can use. So I'm going to show you how to make this. It's really simple to create this kind of effect. What we're going to do, we have our H1 and we have our data attribute set onto it using the text that's in our H1, same as all of the other examples that I showed you before. On the H1, we set our font family. In this case, I'm using Core Circus, and then we set a color. That gives me this, which is not fun. So we add a pseudo element, and all I'm doing in here is instead of slicing it or blending it or any of that kind of stuff, I'm just going to add a different font family. There's one that I like in Core Circus called Core Circus Dot. I've added a font weight of normal because the pseudo element inherits the bold from the H1, and I've made the color white, and that gives me this. And then the last part is a text shadow. The text shadow is basically the white keyline outline and the blue. It looks really scary if you don't work with text shadows, but it's actually really simple. It's got two parts. The first part is a 1 pixel outline, and all you do is offset the text shadow by 1 pixel on all sides, which is what I'm doing in that top part. And then for the 3D blue part, that bit there, whatever direction you want it to go in, you just increment. So the first bit, 1 pixel does the bottom and sides, and then you just keep going until you get the desired distance that you want away from the text. It's really, really straightforward. Now, when you go to use layered fonts, you'll find that a lot of them include that 3D area. They've got a special layer to do that. You could use that. I don't like to for a couple of reasons. One, why waste one of my pseudo elements on something I can recreate in CSS? And the other reason is why load in another font, which is going to impact my performance when I can do that with a single line of CSS. So keep in mind that there are other layers, but whatever you can remake in CSS, do that instead, because you don't want to keep loading in heaps and heaps of font families. That being said, I do have an example that uses 5 different font families, which I'll show you in a minute. There are heaps of font families out there that do this. This is Yaki by Novotype. Novotype is super awesome because when all my fonts trials expired, I hit them up and said, can I have your fonts for free for my demos? And they said yes, so I like them. This is Core Circus with a different font family, so line instead of dot. This is Festivo Letters, Wonder. I could never remember what this is called, so I just made the text say Wonder. This is my favorite. This is Rig Shaded by Jamie Clark, and this uses 5 of his font layers. I think it's spectacular. It's my favorite layered font on the web. His shadows are amazing. So, like I said, this works everywhere, but there are, of course, other things you can do with fonts, and that brings me to variable fonts. Is that? Oh, you don't get to see the animation. This, unfortunately, does not have as good support as the other font examples that I've shown. But what is great about variable fonts, let's see if this example works. There we go. So variable fonts, for those that have never heard of them before, are basically a single font file that contains multiple, I guess, font variants or font styles. So this is like a narrow version, and then there's also like a wide version. Each variable font contains multiple access points, and inside the access points you'll have default ones like weight, width, slant, that kind of stuff. But they can also define custom access points, like I've got a few different ones that I'll show you in a minute. There's ones that do inline or skeletons and stuff like that. And because it's all in the one font file, the way these fonts work is they interpolate between the 2 different styles that they've defined. And what that means is we can animate between the wide and the narrow, which is pretty cool from an animation perspective with fonts on the web. I made this example last week and I really hated it because I thought it was really lame, and it didn't really show off variable fonts in all their glory. So this time last Thursday I had nothing to show you other than this, but I made this one, which I'm really proud of. I feel like this is peak accomplishment for me. I'm going to show you how to make it because it's really easy. Let's load up CodePen. So the way this works is we load our special variable font in with font face, and then we set our H1 with a font family of whatever that font is. In this case, it's called Decovar Regular, and this one's really good if you want to have a play because it's got lots of options. And then the important bit here is font variation settings, and this is where we reference the different access points in the font. So if I just set these back to 0, you'll see what they kind of look like. So that's my font on its own. Because I'm not using weight or slant or width, these ones are weird 4-digit references. This one actually just means inline, and it looks like this. So inline. And then the other one is interestingly called Skeleton Worm. Yeah, and it looks like this. It's like little squarey, knobbly bits. So as I was playing around with this last week with my cup of tea, I discovered that if you combined the 2, they kind of look like leaves. Which I was like, yes, I know exactly what I'm going to do with this. So what I wanted to do first was make it look like it was growing. So I've got my little animation here. And my keyframe animation for this is literally just starting off with inline and skeleton set to 1000. And then I'm just making skeleton sit at, skeleton worm sit at 0 at 50%. And then it just goes back round to 1000. So it just goes in and out. And because I've set that to infinite, it will just happen forever, which is wonderful. Now, I'm going to turn that off, and the reason for that is that there's a memory leak in Chrome with these, and it will basically destroy your computer. So apparently it is being worked on. I was talking to someone about it yesterday, and they said they're working on it, so hopefully they'll get that fixed before these end up everywhere. But to finish the text off, I'm going to add a background image to my H1, which is that. It looks like grass. I'm going to put background clip in, because why not? And also text fill color, because I want to be able to see my grass. And that gives me that. I'm then going to add a text shadow. Really simple text shadow too. Nothing fancy. That gives me some depth. I've added a before in as well because I wanted to try and create more depth and layers with this. I have been meaning to try seeing if I can do it without the pseudo elements, but I haven't got background to it. That gives you kind of a bit more like depth and structure. I like it because it looks like a hedge. And then I just added another one, which is really difficult to see, but it actually does, on my HD monitor, make it look cooler. So yeah, and then let's just for fun look at it again, because it's pretty neat. And let's do this too, because it's just text. Didn't select it. What a noob. There we go. Editable, selectable, searchable, growing, grass text. That's pretty neat. Now, I know that variable fonts aren't supported everywhere, but I do think it's worth playing around with them because people don't know what we're going to do with things until we've done it. So if you start playing with them now, they can fix the memory leaks in Chrome and be like, oh, you want to animate the fonts. Okay. They can fix that and make it work. And you can do something like this. So because we're changing the font itself, when you add a text shadow, the text shadow disappears where the font disappears because it's attached to the actual font file itself, which this is my favorite. I don't know why everyone likes the grass one. I think this is really cool. You can also do this. This is an icon of a cat. It's actually using the cat emoji, and it just, yeah, it's the emoji. And the font just does that. There's all sorts in there. There's a turtle, there's an owl that shrugs, there's a Batman on a bicycle. What I'll be really interested to see with this is whether or not icon fonts become a thing again, because, you know, a lot of us have shifted to SVGs. So who knows? Maybe icon fonts will have their day again. There's also this one. I like this one too. This is trippy. This is like blend modes and background clip and variable fonts and pseudo elements. There's a lot going on there. I think I used screen. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about before I finish up is clip path. Clip path basically allows you to display a specific region of an element rather than showing the complete area. So it's kind of works similar to cutting the width of our text, but the bonus is that clip path lets you create all sorts of shapes like stars and arrows and Batman heads if you want to. Oh, I should make a demo of that. I might do that. So I'm going to show you how to make this. Really simple alternate version of our split vertical layout. I'm not going to do it in a code pen, mainly because the syntax for clip path is a little bit long and diagrams are better to explain. So we start off with something like this. It's got a linear gradient in the background, and then I've got my H1, a before and an after pseudo element set up. And when you go to use clip path, depending on the kind of shape that you want to create, depends on the syntax that you use. So a circle defines a radius, whereas a polygon defines a set of coordinate points. I'm going to tell you how polygon works because I think it's the most versatile, because you can have like 4 points or 2 points or 100 points if you want. And if you look at the diagram in the top right, this is going to show you which each point corresponds to. So I've got a container, and then my clip path references that whole container. So the first point I've got there is 70% from the left and 0% from the top. The top right point, 100% from the left, 0% from the top. Bottom right point, 100% left, 100% top. And then bottom left point is 70% left, 100% top. And what that does is give me that little region on the end, and only that little region. The rest of it is clipped away and we don't see it. So if we put this on the after and we change the color of our text to whatever color we want, it's going to only show that color text in this last region because we've told it to ignore everything on the other side. All this stuff here is invisible, much like how overflow works with width. And then we just do the same thing for that middle region, except that now it's 30% from the left, and then we've got 70%, etc. And we do the same thing, and it gives us just that middle region on the before. Now, because the H1 is just how we want it to be, we don't have to do anything, so we just leave it. And as you can see, this text is multi-line. You can have whatever colors that you want. You could put whatever shapes you want in there. So it gives you quite a lot to work with. Unfortunately, support is not awesome. Chrome, the little icon for Chrome means partial support. What that means is it doesn't support external SVGs. So if you're like importing stuff, that doesn't work, but you can just define that polygon value and it'll work. Firefox is awesome. Safari is the same as Chrome, WebKit browsers. Edge does not support it, though I have heard that they're working on it, and it should come soon. IE is never going to happen. And Android, not sure what's going on there, the default browser, but at least Chrome on Android supports it. One thing to note about Firefox, if they've got in Nightly a really awesome interface for editing clip path. So if you click on developer tools where you see the CSS for the polygon or whatever, you click on it and it brings up all of the points in the browser and you can just move them around and it updates. So it's pretty neat, their tools that they've got. I just tweeted about it today because Jen Simmons posted about it. It's really awesome. Highly recommend you go check it out. It also works for shapes. So this is a really simple example of how this works. I've just got a cross clip path cutting the text out. You can also make angled fractured text if you want it to be a little bit more interesting. You can make, this is my abstract art. It uses blend modes as well. I like blend modes. Yeah, it does not mean that I'm crazy. It just means that I think it looked cool with the Z. You can bend it around a corner. I like this one too. I think that's really neat. You can do something like this. This uses layered fonts, background clip for gradient text, and clip path. It uses rig shaded, if you're wondering. It's such a great font. You can create more interesting layouts like this one. These are, I kind of recreated this from a magazine because I wanted to see if I could do it. But this is, you can do stuff like this with that original example with width if you simplify it a bit. But if you do it with clip path, you just have more control, which is why I like using clip path for it. You can also do this. So this clip path just goes around the dress and it just shows the bit in the middle. Now, interestingly, after I posted this on CodePen, Anna Tudor, I don't know if you guys have heard of her, she posted a really great article on CSS tricks about it, but she talks about different ways you can achieve this using blend modes and filters. So worth checking out. Really, really interesting read. It's cool that it's got my thing in there too. Or you can make this. This is my favorite. This text effect was a Photoshop tutorial that I remade in CSS, and it was actually one of the first ones that I made. The way that it works is pretty simple. The top half is just using a height with that first example that I showed you with the overflow hidden. I've got a H1 on the bottom with an inset text shadow, and then the bottom part is using clip path to hide the top, and then I'm just applying transforms to make it look like it's coming off the page. It was actually a lot more simple to set up than I thought it would be, but if you'd had asked me over a year ago if you could make this in CSS, I would have said, absolutely not. That is not possible. You are crazy. And I would have probably bitched about my designers about the stupid stuff they were doing. So what I think is really important to consider about this is when you get a design from a designer, or if you are a designer, the things that we used to think weren't possible in CSS actually are possible now. You just have to play around with it a little bit and experiment and use the tools that we have at hand. And in fact, this text effect, I've had a few people come back to me and say, oh, I remade this with a line height hack so you don't need click path, or they made it with 3D transforms and perspective to clip it on the 3D plane. So there are a bunch of ways that you can recreate this. So if 2 people have come to me with other ways that you can achieve this effect, I'm sure there are many more. And on that note, I'm going to finish up, and I hope that you go away from this, and if you're designing or you get a design and you automatically go, nope, not possible, you might take a step back and think, oh, maybe it is, maybe I can create more interesting layouts, maybe I can create more interesting text. And always remember that because everything that I've shown you today is just text, you can also do it to emojis. So have some fun there. That second one is called Poopnado, and it is on my CodePen. You can screenshot it and put it in Slack if you want it. So that's it. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy the other presentations.